This is an exceptional time. There has been not just a lot happening in the United States, but a lot happening in the field of evaluation over recent years, even the last decade. So I want to give a really quick tour of why I say that it's an exciting time and an exceptional time, and then put that in some context for the last, what feels like days, and it actually is like hours in our world right now. But I'm going to start with this as a quick analogy and story before I dive into the Evidence Act, or the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act here in the United States. And many of you will look at this and say, that's a tree stump. But I'm going to challenge you for just 10 seconds to say, does anybody know what this is? And the odds are you're going to say it's still a tree stump. And you're right. Last year, I had the chance to do a goal of mine that's existed for a very long time, which was to go out to Kings Canyon in California and see the giant sequoias. They're beautiful, fascinating trees and great testaments to the ecology of the United States and our national parks. In the late 19th century, 1893, this tree was cut down. And it was cut down before these trees were protected. Most people in the United States had no idea what these things were, but loggers cut it down not to build a house, not to make toothpicks, not to make lumber. They cut down this tree to provide evidence to people that these trees existed. So this tree is 100 feet in circumference, and it took them days to cut this down. They cut it into little chunks, and they shipped it to the Chicago World's Fair to prove that the trees existed. So in all its majesty, its magnificence, its beauty, cut it down, shipped it over. And they wanted to share that with the world. So they took this to the World's Fair, they reassembled it, and they had a photo of what the forest looked like, a photo of the tree and its originality, and they even had people who were there to describe what had happened. And nobody believed it was real. They called it a hoax. They said it was fake. There was no belief that this could possibly be a real tree based on its size. So what was missing? Lots of things. So lots of things were missing, even though the evidence was right in front of the people who were looking at this tree. The core of the tree trunk was there. They had people to tell them what they were seeing. They had a photo. They were missing all of the context. They didn't have the rest of the tree. They didn't have other trees from the forest. They didn't have maybe trust, maybe credibility. Hopefully, none of you are doubting the reality of this tree or the forest that the giant sequoias are in today. And if you do doubt the reality and existence of these trees, maybe just don't tell us. But this is a lesson in this moment in time, I think, that's really relevant for the field of evaluation and the field of evidence-informed policymaking and decision-making more broadly from my view. The evidence often is not enough. You need context, you need trust, you need credibility. And many of the things that I'm going to talk about in the next few minutes, I want to also contextualize with this point, that the challenges that we face have actually existed for decades and well over a century in this field. And they're not going away immediately. So keep this point in mind for those of you that are students, for those of you that are faculty, that we have been making vast improvements, but we still have a long ways to go. So here we go. I'm going to start cranking through a bunch of stuff now. So in the United States, for many years, decades, even in some cases over a century, going back to that point in time that I'm describing with the sequoias, we've been building this framework of knowledge. And we have privacy laws, data sharing laws, infrastructure to have processes and information management context in place. And it is wickedly complicated. You don't need to understand all of these moving pieces, but all of this framework ultimately supports how we conduct evaluation in the United States. But there are tremendous gaps. Many of the things that we have adapted over the last 10 to 15 years build on that framework that I just showed you. We went through a period of reform to focus on performance management and performance monitoring goals in the United States. In the Obama administration, which was my longest period of time in the US government, we had open data policies and actually expanded some of the performance management context. And it wasn't until really leaning in at the end of that period that we took a step back and said, but what does all of this mean? And how do we make more improvements to lean in and go forward? There's an important point as we look at how the policy framework has been set up, which is by and large, when we talk about data, evidence, evaluation, these things don't happen in a political sphere historically. In the United States, they tend to happen in a bipartisan fashion, meaning our Congress on both sides of the aisle, our Democrats and Republicans, generally agree on the approaches that we take. The executive branch generally agrees with how the Congress approaches some of these issues. They tend to not be politically controversial. We'll see if that is the case going forward. But in the last decade, and as this slide is demonstrating, there's been a lot of fundamental change in how we approach data, evaluation, and even performance topics in the United States. The common theme across all of that activity is really pretty simple. There's a recognition that we need more capacity, more institutionalization, and candidly, much more direction in how we approach all of these topics. One of the major milestone points in all of that work was back in 2016 and 2017, when folks took a step back and said, we can't get answers to some of the key questions that we have. How do we organize and rationalize a lot of this context? Congress created a commission to study exactly how to do that. It was called the U.S. Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking. Without giving you the really deep dive into all of the contours of that, they unanimously recommended 22 different things. And out of that commission, it really catapulted the legal framework that we have today to succeed, because of the unanimity from individuals who generally disagree on everything from privacy to analytical frameworks to maybe even their epistemological starting point or how they maybe see the world. They unanimously developed a framework that said we need evaluation, we need improved data sharing, but we also need an enhanced capacity to actually undertake all of this work. So that was the literal foundation for how the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act came to be. That law moved through our political process rapidly. You may have noticed about the United States, we do not create laws rapidly in a general sense. But the fact that this law moved through our Senate unanimously and through our House of Representatives almost unanimously, I think is a testament to the political desire to have the knowledge that people want to make decisions. And that's notwithstanding the reality that values and ideological preferences will always play a role in a democratic society in making decisions, but there's a need to have more insight and information to support those decisions. So here's what's in the Evidence Act. Just zooming in really quickly, the key themes that are there. 3 core themes. 1, improving data access. At the same time, behind the scenes, lots of improvements to improve quality of information, the fitness for purpose, things like that that support evaluation. If you're going to improve access to data, you also have to enhance the privacy protections. This includes civil and criminal penalties that are associated with certain violations. It's an interesting day, in fact, to actually talk about that. So you can go deep weeds on that if you'd like. But then for this conversation, an entire infrastructure that now exists for how government-wide in the United States we talk about evaluation capacity. So for the first time ever, there is a government-wide expectation that we are conducting evaluation for both the purposes of accountability and continuous improvement in learning. And I highlight both of those purposes very intentionally, because for many years, historically in the United States, that learning function was often lost in the discourse about evaluation. We tended to focus largely on accountability, but now we're also focusing on that learning function. So the Biden administration issued a lot of the guidance, even though President Trump signed the Evidence Act back in 2019, just based on how time flows. The Biden administration issued a lot of that guidance, and we've seen early indications that when it comes to evaluation, that guidance will continue into the current administration. So for this law, the Evidence Act in the United States, what this is really doing is connecting evaluation into a broader ecosystem that exists when it comes to collecting, managing, and using data, and is really setting in place a foundation for cultural change. And I'm going to also intentionally use that term culture because no law can actually change culture. It's one of the things that we aspire to. We would love to be able to write in a law and say, you shall change your culture and do X, Y, and Z. But no law can successfully do that. And so what a law has to do is set up the tea leaves of how you change culture in organizations and institutions. And some of the things that are really intentionally designed in the Evidence Act that do that are around people and processes and policies. And so some of those things that you see are, for example, the creation of evaluation officers, a position that's a leader in every large department in the United States federal government that says you're now responsible for ensuring that there is an evaluation capacity in your department. And what that looks like will vary across the departments. Some have federated models, some have centralized models, some have dispersed models, and they are all a little bit different. But it also syncs to capacity that exists in other parts of the organization. So just for example, the law also created chief data officers, and there's an expectation that these functions coordinate with each other. So there's no expectation that an evaluation official has to coordinate all of the data assets across an agency that might actually be relevant for doing evaluation. But we know administrative records are often used and very frequently used for evaluation purposes and should be, including as a way to mitigate some of the costs. So the law did not provide funding, importantly. It set up the policies, the processes, the procedures for lots of things when it comes to evaluation, but what it required was goodwill, energy, and enthusiasm from these leaders to do evaluation, and then they had to go find their own funding. So while these structures are sort of set up and in motion, there's still a lot of gaps that exist in how agencies establish these frameworks. So what does that look like in practice when you look across the federal infrastructure? Well, it sort of depends on where you sit. I'm just going to pull up all of these pictures for the sake of time. On the left side here is sort of like the fully loaded model. Maybe this is an agency that if you were building the infrastructure with Legos, my son is 7 years old, so just deal with the Lego analogy if you don't mind. They have a fully contextualized operational model where they've got evaluation policies, people, maybe a learning agenda, which is a research and evaluation strategy. They might have an annual evaluation plan. They can see what everything looks like. And we'd say, congratulations, good for you. You sort of have the full thing designed soup to nuts. Then there are a whole bunch of agencies that are somewhere in the middle of this. Maybe their Legos are scattered out on the floor. They can see what the end of the process looks like because they have some instructions. And they know that there's a house at the end of the road, but they just are in the process of building it. And there's a lot of agencies in the United States that look like this right now. But there are also some of these agencies that are single person shops. Maybe it's a person who has no idea what evaluation is because they were tapped as the evaluation officer and somebody said, congratulations, but we also need you to go look and figure out what evaluation is. And those are the cases where we know they need a lot of support. And it's kind of a mess in those agencies, to be really honest, because they're learning how to do this for the first time. And we know that they will have a long road ahead of them. So what you see might depend on where you sit in those agencies and depend on how much resourcing and history and context they have to support this work. But the goal is that the Evidence Act is bringing everyone up to a level where they are completing some level of evaluation function as a core function of government. And we're making some improvements on that over time. Okay, so where are we today in this says 2024. I realize it's a new year. When I made this slide back at the end of last year, and we last looked across the board at the evaluation officers in the United States, before the new administration came in, we did have evaluation officers in every single one of the large federal agencies. For the most part, with the exception of our Department of Defense, every single one of those agencies had publicly available what we call a learning agenda, which is that research and evaluation strategy document that they'll develop every 4 years to tell us and give some indication of the big questions that align with strategic plans that they'll work into evaluation activities. Almost every agency had publicly available their evaluation policies that tell us how they'll deal with things like transparency and rigor and how those will be implemented in every evaluation activity across the department. And when we surveyed in partnership with the American Evaluation Association last year, the vast majority of evaluation officials in government told us they're actually seeing improvements in capacity, which is exactly what we wanted to observe in the government. Now, how does this translate into real-world impact? Does the capacity translate into something that manifests in better outcomes for government? Truthfully, We're waiting to see more evidence of this. But there are really early indicators that the answer is yes. The evaluation community is increasingly being brought into regulatory actions. The new administration has just issued a new executive order in the last week on regulations. So we will have to see what that looks like going forward past this week. But leading up to that executive order, the evaluation community was intentionally being pulled in more to look at how you translate prospective analysis into retrospective analysis, which was a positive indicator. The strategic planning intersection was because the learning agendas were designed to be part of a quadrennial strategic planning exercise. And we expect that that will continue going forward. When it comes to operational decision-making, that is one of the key areas that individual senior executives at agencies have told us that they found the evaluation community to be particularly useful in recent years. Wrapping up here, there are tons of resources that are available on a website called evaluation.gov, and I'm not going to talk through these other than to say they are there. Apologies for any transitions that lead to static dead links as the administration is shifting around, but may be able to Google and find some of these things still available. But all of these documents that I'm referring to that are a lot of the progress that has happened, that is about the transparency of the evaluation function in the US, is also part of our excitement of how the community is developing and building itself to be more robust. One thing that I will highlight there is the term community. The federal evaluation community of the US government is actually strengthening itself over time. And part of that is self-organization. So while the government conducts a lot of evaluation activities through contracts in the United States, that contracting community is also becoming more well-versed in how to better support evaluation. So that means they're learning more about methods, they're learning how to do better procurement activities, and that's a really good indicator of how we ultimately produce better statements of work that lead to better contracts. So for those of you that are interested in that line of business or line of work, really cool indicator. Okay, so what does this mean for resourcing, at least in the United States? Just keep in mind, a lot of these offices are still pretty small. If you've been tracking the news globally about the United States, we have tons of expectations that there are going to be massive budget growth in the US federal budget in coming years. However, a lot of the evaluation function will likely have a positive feedback loop into some of the decisions that are being made. Don't have any particular insights about what the budget numbers will look like for these offices, but it has been identified as a core function of government. So that does suggest that there might be some stability going forward. One interesting thing is just in the survey that we did last year, there is still a large cohort of evaluation officials that are spending less than the majority of their time on evaluation. So it's interesting that they're being tagged as the evaluation official in an agency, but still spending relatively little time on the function. So hopefully that'll be something that we can address in coming years. I keep mentioning the learning agendas, and I also just want to highlight this for you in that context about resourcing, because there's a direct correlation to this chart, which is about the questions, and we could delve deeper here into the types of questions that are in the learning agendas. So the trend here should jump out at you. I realize this is a bar chart, and I shouldn't use the term trend, but on the x-axis is the agency acronym in the United States for the federal agency. The y-axis is the number of questions that are in a learning agenda. And some agencies have a lot of questions. The Department of Housing and Urban Development actually had learning agendas prepared before federal law required it. They had well over 100 questions. The department or the U.S. aid agency, you may have observed in recent days, has received a vast amount of political attention. There is a great level of heterogeneity in how agencies approach the evaluation function, but also how much political support they receive within their agencies, which affects everything from resourcing to the level of what they can publish in their learning agendas and strategic planning documents. And that's an important piece of context that affects the evaluation community at this moment in the United States. Okay, so what does all this mean as we look forward to going ahead in the current environment and literally the moment that we are in? There are tons of opportunities, notwithstanding politics, notwithstanding resourcing. And I appeal to this community in particular to sort of think back to my analogy about the sequoias, because I'm an eternal optimist about some of these things. And we have a great opportunity to sort of demonstrate the value proposition that evaluation has to offer in this moment. AI actually is one of those opportunities, even though I know many are scared about those opportunities for integration into evaluation. It does pose strategic elements that can be useful for everything from improving how we manage data quality to even how we conduct some of our thinking and evaluative approaches in conducting the evaluation process itself. Stakeholder engagement is going to be a very important topic as we go forward. And while the evaluation community has been focused on this for decades, government has struggled with this, particularly in the United States. Just in the last week of the Biden administration, there was guidance that was issued to federal agencies about stakeholder engagement. It is currently the standing guidance still to this day in the United States government. And it encourages federal agencies to improve how they interact with the American public and improve policies and practices. And that has a cascade effect into how we conduct evaluations. So hopefully that'll be something that manifests in coming weeks and months. Back to the learning agendas, agencies will again update these learning agendas by federal law in this year as part of the quadrennial process when they're updating the strategic plans. So it will be an opportunity for the evaluation community to also come into the discussion about, regardless of the values of the administration or the ideological approaches that are being applied for particular policy decisions, how do we evaluate some of these key questions to look at the long-term implications? And then one of my sort of major themes in all of this work is, how do we know if all of this is going to matter or work in the long term? How do we evaluate the Evidence Act and the evaluation community's impact in 5 years, coming back to how do we demonstrate that value proposition? And just as we preach to everyone else that this matters, we need to also make sure that we're demonstrating that value. So where do we prioritize our efforts? I'm a big believer that we do need some resources for this community. We vastly need to improve our ability to explain why this matters, but also tell those success stories of how evaluation has impacted the community for success and build more trust in our community. So I can talk about more of these in the Q&A, but again, I'll just say thank you all for your attention. Thanks for your interest in the Evidence Act, and onward. Lots to do.
Well, thanks very much, Nick. That was an excellent overview of what's been going on in the US and all the changes that have come into place. So Rob, turn it over to you.
All right, thanks, Brad. So Brad has asked me to talk a little bit based on Nick's presentation on the status and structure of policy evidence in the Canadian context and some of the challenges that we're experiencing and opportunities north of the border. And I'm not going to go into many of the macro concepts that Nick talked about, because many of those apply as well north of the border. But I will say, and just root this, Canada has an Evidence Act as well, but it relates to judicial evidence and not policy evidence. So Canada's approach is that it uses various administrative policy frameworks to guide its policy decisions. And most of these tend to be overseen by a central agency called Treasury Board Secretariat, and it oversees various elements of policy evidence that Nick referred to, such as privacy and access, performance management, audit, eval, risk, etc. We also have what is called the Open Government Initiative, and that really does demand departments and agencies post their data and reports, although we've noticed that that's not always consistently applied across the 120 departments, agencies, and other institutions, and that just frames the federal government. We also have various evidence gathering and analyzing bodies, including StatsCan, various security agencies, health, regulatory, much in the same way that the US does. And clearly the challenge is sharing that information that jointly contributes to a policy decision or frames policy decision making around particular questions. Then something Nick that did not talk about, but I'm sure also applies, is that we have many data storage systems north of the border, and many of these tend to be legacy systems now that are very difficult to feed and maintain. And anybody that's Canadian will know we've had our share of snafus around Phoenix and other such systems that are not exactly doing the job anymore and need some help. We're also facing, as Nick mentioned, some capacity and capability gaps across the board, while the need for greater collaboration within and between institutions is significantly increasing, particularly, I hate to say, particularly given threats from the south of the border and other threats around the world, including cybersecurity and other problems. So getting data and evidence into the hands of decision makers appears to be one of our greatest challenges. If you've been following Canadian news lately, there are major calls for provinces and territories to actually join in these sorts of initiatives, to join up their data and evidence gathering frameworks and provide our political decision makers with information faster, more nimbly, to come to policy solutions that are making sense in a federated system of government. And that's always been a challenge, both in Canada and south of the border. With respect to our evaluation functions, unlike the US, where there are a bit of a scattered framework of evaluation across departments, Canada, by statute, has to have evaluation, audit, and other functions resident within their departments. I myself led one of those for many years. The challenge is, given times of crisis and turbulence that we're seeing, breaking out of old ways of doing things, such as looking to the past for some evidence of what's likely to occur in the future, is not likely to bear fruit. So we're needing new ways to coordinate our information and help out our decision makers in a way that makes sense. During the pandemic, we actually had a few good examples of departments doing exactly that, where evaluation units were participating very well with other units within departments and across departments to help decision makers. Health Canada and the Public Health Agency of Canada are most well known for being on the ground, providing real-time evidence to support decision making. From a policy framework perspective, we've got a number of our frameworks are under review right now. The policy on results, which replaced the evaluation policy, has been under review for more than 3 years. And our challenge with respect to some of these frameworks is really, and I know Nick referred to this or implied some of this in his comments, there's oftentimes a confusion or lack of agreement on what the North Star is of these policy frameworks, especially when you map these sorts of policies on other ones. In the Canadian context, it's the policy on service and digital, which is supposedly trying to combine our programs and services directed at providing better service delivery for Canadians with a digital transformation strategy. And many public servants north of the border are confusing what the purpose is of combining what used to be separate frameworks. But it's the lack of this North Star. What is the meaning of evidence, and what systems are we trying to feed, and what kind of decisions are we trying to inform, whether that's at the strategic level, the tactical level, the operational level, the whole of government level. Many of these functions tend to get overwhelmed, and there's a great deal of confusion sometimes as to what the purpose is of even carrying out an audit or evaluation, let alone trying to design these. So I'm going to wrap up here and say there are many opportunities ahead. And like Nick, I tend to be an optimist in some of these things. AI is obviously a big consideration, and many of our units are struggling with how to include AI type platforms into the work that they do, mainly to increase efficiency. If you're trying to think about AI to help with effectiveness, that may not be wise just yet, but finding ways to better gather data is really positive. And I have a very quick story around this. So the Bank of Canada was asked by Cabinet to understand some short and medium term effects of a 25% tariff imposed by the US, and a crack group of Bank of Canada economists, very highly paid, took over 2 weeks to come to a report. And then this reporter comes from the CBC doing the same thing in about an hour. And the numbers were very, very close. The level of detail in the analysis wasn't quite as deep, but at least the numbers were close. So that gives you, so obviously the Bank of Canada, who I worked with quite closely, said, crap, like we could have saved a lot of time here and focused on other things. So we're all trying to learn this as we go along. Stakeholder engagement is another area of opportunity. And I think evaluation units in Canada are finding very creative ways to penetrate different lines of inquiry. I'm mentioning here particularly our Indigenous communities, which I've spoken about before through self-government agreements. And the self-government agreements are constructed in a way that evidence is from the bottom up or top down through a centralized framework. And what these First Nations and other Indigenous communities are demanding is, no, we want control over the design of our information frameworks. And we're going to have to find more creative ways that support better decision-making that addresses what may be going on in Indigenous communities. And evaluators are kind of front of the line here on pushing some of this innovation forward. We have other patterns that are going on in provinces and territories. We also have chief data and digital officers that are not quite getting along, but increasingly there are demands to do that. So I'm seeing, at least on our side of the border, the role of evaluation is changing very quickly, and they're actually leading in many respects on what the nature is of evidence, not so much looking toward the past, but to ask the question, how can we better support our elected and management decision makers to do what they need to do to push these policy agendas forward? And to me, that's a great way forward. So Brad, I'll kind of stop there.
Well, that's excellent, Rob. Thank you so much. There's a lot of points of intersection with the U.S. perspective that you mentioned, and the points about the learning agenda and privileging, learning a little bit more than we have done in the past, and the stakeholder engagement certainly resonate with me.